Have you ever found yourself in the situation where you just offed your father, but you decide that you need to take and finish his canal project, and then you also decide that you don't want to follow in his footsteps, so you order a whole new series of canals to be built because you're just that original? Or maybe it's just my patrons. All of this and so much more happened in ancient China, but we're going to get more into that later. This week we're heading to China to look at a series of canals that were constructed between the Hangzhou province and the Zhejiang province. And these series of canals form what is called the Great Canal, and a great canal it is. It stretches about 1,800 kilometers in length and was constructed by man. Yeah, I say constructed by man. We're going to get more into that in a bit. But the Grand Canal didn't start its life off as the Grand Canal. It originally started off as a small section of canal between the Yangtze and the Huai River. This section of the canal was built during the 5th century BCE, and this was a time of change and turmoil in ancient China. The 5th century BCE in China is called the Spring and Autumn period, and it was followed by the Warring States period. But to understand the construction of this original canal, we actually need to look at the Spring and Autumn period as well as the Warring States period. The Spring and Autumn period started around 770 and ended in 476 BCE. The main power in China at this time was the Zhou dynasty. We're not exactly sure when it started, but the common agreement is between 1046 and 256 BCE. And the Zhou dynasty went through many different changes, and the only change that we're really concerned about is the Eastern Zhou dynasty. The Eastern Zhou dynasty was from around 770 to 256 BCE, and it was a time of a lot of violence and great change. And the people during this time seen a lot of endless warfare that often ended in neither side winning, because everybody used the exact same tactics. It was because of these endless wars that they actually constructed the first canal. This canal was constructed to transport troops to make it faster, and hopefully they would be able to win some battles. And this leads us into the Warring States period between 475 and 221 BCE. It didn't last very long, but there was a lot more change to come. By the time of the Warring States period, the Zhou dynasty was considered very weak, and there were nearly 100 different states in China. But by the 4th century BCE, nearly all these states had been conquered by other states, forming the 7 major players. But even after nearly conquering all these little states, the 7 major states still weren't happy. They wanted more power, so they started to go to war with each other, and they started to build defensive structures. And if you want to know more about that, check out the video I made on the Great Wall. And the Zhou dynasty during the Warring States period received no respect, because at a time when military power was everything, they had very little of it. And as if this wasn't bad enough for the Zhou dynasty, each of the major states named their own kings. And they continued what the people at the time probably seen as senseless bloodshed, because between 535 and 286 BCE, there were 358 different wars. Those in charge at the time took a different approach to how they conducted their wars. They lost all the civility, and they went about winning it any way they could. This meant that they slaughtered anybody that got in their way, so even civilians weren't safe. There were a few different changes that made war a little bit more gruesome during this time. The advent of steel occurred. This meant that they could create stronger weapons and stronger armor. And this also changed the way that they fought. Before it was very disorganized. The battlefield started to become more complex during this time. They deployed their troops on the battlefield in a more controlled manner, and they even started to use spies and intrigue to help them win in any way they could. But with more controlled deployment of their troops meant that they also needed more troops. Before this point, their infantries would only reach about 10,000 people, and after this point, they reached into the 200,000s. This meant that the battles they used to conduct that would only last a couple days would now last months or even years. And their death tolls were astronomical, meaning that they would lose tens of thousands of men for just a piece of land. And to reach these massive numbers in the infantry, they took anybody they could. This meant that the people they were taking often weren't trained to fight. And even though they deployed their troops in a more complex manner, the battlefields became more or less just a free-for-all, meaning that the winning side just had to have the larger numbers and outlast the other. And those who fought well were rewarded for their efforts. And the Qin dynasty took this to the next level. Much like a pyramid scheme, they had 20 different ranks that were open to everyone. But where a pyramid scheme tends to avoid asking you to kill people to move up, the Qin had no such scruples about this. And nowadays, where you take and you give your money to somebody and then you hope that you're going to be able to make it back, the Qin asked their followers to take and sacrifice something much more valuable: their mental stability. For each head that they chopped off and brought back, they got to move up a rank, and they also were given around 5 acres of land. And with all 7 states vying for power, there would have to be one that would win. And eventually it came down to 2 states, the Qin and the Chu. And in 221 BCE, the Qin conquered the Chu. The Qin dynasty would go on to unite all of China, meaning that this original canal was no longer needed. and it would eventually just be forgotten and filled up with silt. With there no longer being a need to transport troops, the idea of a canal would just fall off to the wayside. But it was some 900 years later that a dynasty would actually see the purpose of the canals again. And that dynasty was the Sui dynasty, from 581 to 618 CE. They started the construction on what today we would know as the Grand Canal. The Sui dynasty started under Emperor Wendi, and he started his dynasty much the same way other dynasties at the time were started, by seizing power from the people before him. The previous emperor got sick at the age of 35, and the person that was supposed to succeed him had his sanity brought into question. So Wendi took advantage of all the turbulence at the time, and he took the power for himself. And this all started in the summer of 580 CE. He took his military, and he started to defeat the Zhou loyalists. And if he couldn't defeat them militarily, he would just sit down and talk to them because, you know, talking is always the better option. And by 581, there was nobody left standing in his way. So on the 4th of March in 581, he took the imperial title, thus starting the Sui dynasty. Emperor Wendi seen the benefit the canals could bring, so he started to have them dug. And he seemed to be the only one that seen the importance, because he had to force a lot of people to start making these canals. He used farmers, enslaved people, and even criminals, all forced to dig the canals. No matter how bad Wendi was, his son was even more so, and this is where we started the video. Because in 604, his son, Yang Di, possibly assassinated his father. We're not really certain, but let's be honest, it probably happened. But he did continue on with his father's dream of building the canals, so The canals that Wendi was constructing extended into the north, but like most children, Yang Di wasn't satisfied with just following in his father's footsteps. He had to outdo him, so he started construction on more canals to the south. But this time the canals weren't meant to transport troops so much. They were actually used more to transport food like rice. 607, the original canal that was built back during the 5th century BCE, was reopened. Then in 608, the canal between the south, where the rice was grown, and Beijing was opened up. But Yang Di isn't remembered for those sections of the canals. He's remembered for the section he started in 610. This section of the canal was about 2,414 kilometers in length, and I already said that it took a lot of people to build. The number of people he forced to build the canal had to be large, because it took just 6 years to build this stretch of canal. It took nearly 5.5 million people between the ages of 15 to 50 to build the canal. All of these people were overseen by an armed guard of just 50,000 men, and those that refused to work or tried running away were punished, either by flogging, having to wear a neck weight, or they were just executed. And in those very short 6 years, there were nearly 2 million people that what they referred to as just lost. And if he would have left his father alive for a little bit longer, he may have learned how to run the pocketbook. Because between the large amounts of money that he spent on the Grand Canal, repairing large sections of the Great Wall, and all the money he put into his private palace, where he had large mature trees brought in from a faraway forest, the treasury was just emptied. But these projects weren't the only thing that drained the resources from the empire. He also decided that he was going to expand his land through military power. He invaded what is now Vietnam and into Inner Asia, and then he tried 3 different times to invade South Korea, between 612 to 614, but all 3 attempts to invade Korea failed, and his people started to finally get fed up, and they revolted. And in 618, somebody finally assassinated him. The Grand Canal would continue to be the main way to transport rice from the south to the north, and as the Grand Canal started to grow, so did cities along it. But there would be no new construction on the canal until the Yuan dynasty, between 1279 to 1368. The new canal was meant to be dug between Qingdao and Yuxian, but it was deemed too much of a hassle, so they just abandoned it. They then decided that building a canal between the Henghe River and the Wei River was actually the better way to go about it. And this is where we consider the modern start of the Grand Canal. But even after all the work they did to dig these new canals, it was still cheaper to move food by sea than it was up the new canals. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, the canals needed a lot of work. So in 1403, they undertook the efforts of actually dredging and rebuilding the canals. The canals would remain in use until the 19th century, when floods would actually break the levees of the Henghe River. This caused the section of the canal between Suzhou and Huai to be damaged. Then after the Taiping Rebellion in 1850 to 1864, and the Nian Rebellion between 1853 and 1868, the section of the canal that led to Beijing was no longer used, and it fell into disrepair. And then in 1934, the Chinese government went about repairing a section of the canal between the Huai and the Yangtze. To do this, they had to repair large sections of the canal, and they also dredged it, making it deeper, because they put ship locks in, meaning that medium-sized steamers were now able to use the canal. Then in 1958, they went about repairing the whole canal. They straightened it, made it wider and deeper to accommodate ships weighing up to 600 tons. They also constructed a new segment of the canal that was 65 kilometers in length. The canal is still used to this day, mostly by medium-sized barges, and only really in the south. They also used part of the canal to divert water to the Jiangsu province to help with irrigation. In 2014, the Grand Canal was added to the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The Grand Canal, like the Great Wall, are amazing to look at, but they have a horrible history. But it goes to show us that something that was used to take and ship goods up a river can still be used thousands of years later to do the exact same thing, so really not much of a change, but it's nice to look at and talk about. I want to thank you all for watching, and I want to thank my crew over at Patreon for choosing this video topic. If you want to help support the channel and help choose the next video, then consider heading over to Patreon and becoming part of the crew. For as little as $2 Canadian, which to the rest of the world is just pennies, because somehow Canada is actually considered one of the largest economic powers in the world, you can help choose where we go next, get extra content, and access to the Discord.